So thank you all for being here bright and early on a Sunday morning to talk about mental health. Always enlightening. Okay, so if you want to move us along.
Sure.
So if you want to start us off.
Sure. So we're going to talk about gaming and mental health in the queer community. One of the things that we talked about is that we weren't really sure how to even title this presentation, and we went back and forth a lot. It was between either queer or LGBTQ. We ended up choosing queer because we felt that it was more inclusive. So even though we know that some people still don't identify with this word, that's why we chose it. And I just wanted to be upfront on why we chose that instead of the acronym.
So just to kind of introduce ourselves real quick, I'm Joey Hannah. I'm a licensed psychologist. I work at New Mexico State University.
I'm Serenity Serseción. I'm also studying to be a Ph.D., but right now I only have an MS for the next month.
You're almost there.
I know, almost. And I'm a psychology intern actually up in Oregon, but I'll be coming back down soon.
Yeah. And we got connected to do this talk because we're both gamers and we're both very interested in mental health, obviously. And so this was something that we wanted to do to try to convey some information, see what might be helpful to you all, what you all might need or want to learn about. So we have our agenda, and then hopefully we can get some feedback about what you all want to hear about too. All right? So one of the reasons in particular that we wanted to talk about this is a lot of the research that's out there on gaming really isn't that good. Just to be honest, a lot of it's very negative. So most of the stuff that you probably have heard about would be in the news. You know, video games cause violence, and you know all these things. We'll go through this in a minute. But a lot of it's actually not very good research. Becoming a good consumer of research can be kind of difficult. This is something that we're taught a lot in our field. But you know, if you see something on, God forbid, Fox News, you know, you're going to see a study that's probably not that good, but just because it's been published, everybody goes crazy for it. A lot of stuff, you know, if you're looking for something negative, you're going to find it. And in a lot of research, they found, you know, all these negative things because, one, they were looking for it, and two, it was kind of done by one person who was the editor for the journal. So you can kind of get your stuff published and not have to publish everybody else's things. So a lot of people don't necessarily notice that, and there's a lot of things that don't always get through the mainstream publishing that you don't hear about. So we wanted to try to go through some things that you might have heard about but aren't necessarily true, and there might be some truth to it, but just to give you more clear information. So one of the big points that people talk about is violence, right? That if you play violent video games, you're going to become a violent person. And that's really not true at all. So when somebody says that to you, you can now say, it's not true. There's no research to support it. One thing that people do find is that if you have just naturally aggressive tendencies, you might be drawn towards more violent media. Does that mean you're going to act out on it? Well, no. There are especially with mobile gaming, at least over 1 billion people in this world playing video games. How many of them actually act out on something violent? A very, very, very small percentage. But you see them in the news, so you think it's a ton of people. And actually, a lot of times, if somebody is more aggressive, they play a violent video game, it actually gets those feelings out. You know, a lot of us probably know video games can be an outlet, right? And so if you are more aggressive, if you're playing a violent video game, you actually get a lot of that stuff out of your system, which is probably healthier and safer in a lot of ways. One of the other points was, was with impulsivity. And so impulsivity meaning that you can't really control your urges to do something, you just do it. And you don't really think about it, you don't think about the consequences. And there's a little bit of truth to this, but not in the way that people usually think. A lot of times people think impulsivity, I want it and I want it right now. And that's kind of what it looks like. But with gaming, we're getting instant feedback. When you play a game, when you make a move, when you get a certain score, you get feedback right then and there. And so instead of becoming this, impulsive person that can't control themselves, what we're actually doing is we're retraining our brain. Because when you think about how school systems are set up, you take a class, you maybe do an assignment, you take an exam, you get feedback like maybe a week later. I don't know if anybody's had that kind of experience. So it's delayed gratification, hopefully gratification, if you did well. But it's delayed, right? And so with video gaming, you're learning how to get instant feedback. So your brain changes a little bit. And this is actually something that people are talking a lot about in the school systems, that if this is what kids are learning now and they're training their brains in this way at home, we need to change our school system to meet that, so that people are getting more instant feedback, more interactive kinds of feedback. Where this can be a problem is actually more in the casual gaming community with microtransactions. That dirty word. I see some people shivering, yes. And, you know, we see that a lot, like Candy Crush, you know, and games like that where, sorry, I just saw a lot of people's mouths drop when I said that. You know, and it's just because it's right there, you press a button, you've spent some money, and you don't think about it, you don't think about the consequences, and then you see your bank statement. Yeah. The other area is in social skills. Yeah. And there's always this question of, do video games impair social skills? You know, and the stereotype was somebody sitting in their basement, not interacting with anybody, you know, and just playing video games all day. And in the modern age especially, everything has an online component, for the most part. And so there's some truth to this, like we're not developing social skills, but it's in a non-traditional way. So people, when they say social skills, they're usually saying in-person, live interaction, right? And in video game worlds and online interactions, you're developing social skills, but it's a very different kind of social skill. An online interaction has its own set of rules, its own language sometimes, and it's just different. It's not any less valid of a social skill, it's just a different kind than what people are typically researching or trying to look at. One of the things I like to think about is if you were to take somebody who has never had any sort of exposure to online video gaming and they have great in-person social skills, put them online, they may have no idea what they're doing. And they may struggle with that in the same way that somebody who's been gaming all their life might struggle with an in-person, face-to-face interaction. So again, it's not that it's a bad social, it's not that you're not learning social skills, it's more of that you're learning a different set of social skills. The other thing, and I think you might be able to speak a little bit more to this, is that this can sometimes also be helpful for people with different kinds of disorders, might be on the autism spectrum, maybe have social anxiety.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've done in my practice with people who have social anxiety, specifically in our gamers, is figuring out how can I help this person have more social interactions online first. So how do we test out just an average conversation? You know, today on your MMO, I want you to talk to someone who you don't know, a stranger. Just say hi, maybe join their party, something like that. And it becomes a part of treatment, and it's really helpful because then after they practice that, then we can start practicing in-person interaction. I'll have people come into the session who'll talk about gaming. So it's about a topic that the person feels comfortable about. So when it comes to social interaction, I do think that online social interaction can be really helpful. And in person, it's just, like you were saying, it's just a little bit different.
Yeah. So with attention and concentration, a lot of people have been saying in the news that with things like ADHD, are people familiar with ADHD? Yeah, that video games are to blame. They're the big evil that has caused all of the ADHD and all of the children all around. And this actually isn't true. A lot of the studies, the good studies that have been published, have shown that children and adults that have trouble with attention and concentration actually can learn more skills through video games. The confusion is that impulsivity piece. People see the impulsivity and they say, you know, oh my God, here are these kids and they're just not able to hold attention and do this and do that. And it's actually a little bit more of that impulsivity part. It really has very little to do with ADHD. And I don't know about you all, but have you ever tried to play a platformer when you're distracted? How many times did you die? You know, you can't have distraction when you're playing games for the most part. And so there's really not a lot of research to support this idea that if you are playing a lot of video games, you're going to develop ADHD. That's not really how it works. But again, that information gets out there. Another good example, there's this study that was done through the University of Florida and a couple of other schools. I just know it because I went to UF. It's called the ACTIVE study, and it was a group of researchers that was actually looking at elderly and aging populations and gave them a bunch of DSs with brain age and monitored their cognitive abilities and actually saw improvements. So video games can be helpful too. And of course, we have to talk about addiction, right? Because addiction is another one of those big things that comes up all the time. I was probably that kid grabbing onto his computer. It's not me, not really, but could have been. So most of the time people, when they're talking about gaming addiction, they basically are talking about it from the framework of like a drug addiction. And they're not the same. They're not even close. It's basically like gambling more than anything. There's this idea in psychology and behavioral psychology called schedules of reinforcement. So depending on when you do a behavior and when you are rewarded for that behavior. And in gambling, it's totally random, right? So you keep doing it until you get that payoff and you get all excited, and then you keep doing it again, and then you've lost all of your payoff from before. And gaming can mirror that a little bit because you keep playing till you get your award or your reward of some sort, and you don't always know exactly when that's going to happen depending on the game that you're playing. So that's kind of what keeps people hooked. But a true addiction is very different. With a true addiction, all areas of your life are really severely impaired. And that's the part that can look a little bit like a drug addiction. So things like financial issues, social issues, might be like lying a lot to conceal your behaviors. And there are some people that might have problems with gaming. I don't even know if I want to share how much money I've spent on gaming before. And some of you probably had that experience, and it's just because it's something that might be important to you, or you might prioritize. Maybe you have a little bit of a problem in that area, but that doesn't mean that you are addicted in that like clinical term that you need to go to like rehab or something for. But to give you an idea of why this is an area that is important to talk about, there's this thing called the DSM. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, right? And so this is something that psychologists and psychiatrists use to provide a diagnosis for somebody that they're working with. The DSM-5 came out just recently, and there was a consideration to include, what was it exactly?
Internet and gaming addiction, something like that?
Yeah, a diagnosis for internet and gaming addiction. It's not in the DSM because there was no research to support it. So keep that in mind.
I did want to add that because of that, I feel that a lot of people in our field anyway have been talking about addiction more often, and there is kind of like this stigma that if people game, they're going to be addicted to it. And I do wonder if it's because of all the talk that happened around the DSM.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. So with negative interactions, this is going to shift a little bit, but I think all of us have had at least one experience of a negative interaction online, maybe on Xbox Live or something else. And I can share a lot of my own experiences, but I was wondering if anyone felt comfortable sharing some of theirs. What are some of the things that have happened to you online? Sure.
Well, there's a lot of deception. So, like, I'm a trans guy, I like mostly women, and I'll find a chick, and then it's like, oh, I'm a dude, I'm a 40-year-old married dude, and that's kind of like traumatizing sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is that idea of people being someone who they're not online. Sure, the person in the back.
And then something as a trans woman that happens a lot too, especially vocally, because so many games you interact vocally on like a headset or deck or whatever.
Right.
I used to play WoW a lot, and would constantly get misgendered by guild members just because of my voice.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I've heard that a lot from people. Absolutely.
A huge one that everyone at party probably knows about is the second they find out you're a girl normally, if you're doing something that's not considered a girl game, they get all upset at you, like, oh, what are you doing on here? And they're just like, especially if you start like killing and bullying everyone. Like, when the Halo me, my older brother, and my younger brother always played, and I always died all the time, so I thought I sucked. So when I went to a LAN and they were having a tournament, I was like, I'll play, I'll probably be out in the first round. Ended up winning because apparently my brothers were so much better than everyone else that I was playing against that everyone started getting mad and be like, you're cheating, you're not doing anything, like, you're just using all these OP weapons and it's not fair. Like, I'm just, like, I have a pistol and occasionally I would grab the shotgun. Like, I'm playing the exact same way you guys are, I just happen to be better.
Good for you.
Well, and to add to that, I used to play Halo a lot myself, and I remember that I actually ended up using that voice modification thing that's on Halo, and the reason why I did that is because people would target me.
Yeah.
So actually what would happen is that every time I'd speak up and I sound female, I would die almost instantly.
They assume you're the weaker player.
Correct.
To go after.
Yeah, even my own team would go after me. And so unfortunately, I ended up having to change my voice. So, yeah.
Yeah, and this is something that we hear about a lot. I mean, people sometimes not feeling safe online. And this is where some of those more negative things can come in, that this is unfortunately one of the more true aspects. When you're called things, like you see up here, these are from sites Not in the Kitchen Anymore and Fat, Ugly, or Slutty. Has anybody heard of these sites? And it's these two women that have had these kinds of interactions and been cataloging them to show people like, hey, this is what we're dealing with. So that's where these are from, by the way.
I'll move on to the next one. I mean, I have a non-comprehensive list of all the possible things that you've probably been called at some point online. And what I noticed, at least, is that I feel that people are more of a target if, for women, I've noticed anyone who's not in the gender binary, people of color, if they somehow find out. I was just going to share one short experience when I used to play Left 4 Dead. I always played Lewis because he's my favorite character. I love him, and he's an African American male. And I remember that I would always get targeted because I would either get comments about being black because they assumed that I was, or that I would get comments because I'm a woman. And so it kind of felt like, wow, every single time I play this game, this is what happens. These are the comments that I get, which is kind of disappointing.
Yeah. And so hopefully we'll get into just a little bit later about how to manage some of those interactions or ways that you can have more positive interactions with people as well. Yep. All right.
Okay, so some of the good stuff. So now that we've gone through all the negative, let's talk about what are the positive things of gaming, because if there weren't any positive things, we wouldn't all be gamers, right? So I do feel that these things are not talked about as much in the media. Unfortunately, negative portrayals kind of take over, and they don't talk about some of the benefits that are in gaming. And there actually are games that are therapeutic. I think that many people in the room might be able to have a game or two that really touched you, that really changed who you are as a person, right? So that's a big deal. And I remember when you had written "Problems Lie in the Sand."
Yeah, just thinking that this idea of having a problem with gaming, it's like we were saying before, isn't always that clear to define. And we'll give some examples, I think, in the next part about what that might mean. But just to give you an idea that problem is very individual, and so it's not just this blanket statement that you usually hear about.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really like about gaming is the fact that you can have a safe space and you can feel empowered. You can find a group of individuals that you really relate to that maybe are having the same struggles that you're having. Also the fact that it's a fantasy world. It's a good stress relief just to go and game. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is that in gaming, many people have mentioned that it's a safe place where they can explore their sexuality and gender, for the same reason that you can be whoever you want to be in some games, right? And maybe you're struggling with something in yourself, and this gives you an opportunity to try that out in a safe space, because this isn't trying it out with your friends and family in person. This is a more contained area to do it. Also, that addiction can be treating, if you do have gaming addiction.
Yeah.
There are things that can be done to help with that. And Joey already talked a little bit about how that's different from other addictions.
Yep.
So what are some of the benefits of gaming? Here are just a few. So I just love this picture. So one of the things I was going to share, so I'm actually not originally from the States. I'm actually from Puerto Rico. And my first language was Spanish. And for me, video games really helped me because it actually helped me learn English, which in turn helped me get into a college here in the United States and now be on my way to being a psychologist. And I could have never done that without games. It was actually playing RPGs through my childhood, trying to figure out what they were saying because I didn't know, and eventually getting to a point where I actually started to understand, and it helped me in my day-to-day life, which was great. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the research around this, but just here are some of the things that the research has found that you can get out of a benefit in gaming. Yeah. Do you have anything to add on this one?
I would just say too that with a lot of this stuff, people don't always think about these as being benefits, or they might not think of these as readily available benefits. So when you're playing a game, whether it's console, whether it's PC, whatever it is, you have to do a lot with your hands, and you have to do a lot with hand-eye coordination, spatial reasoning, a lot of things that are hard skills to develop otherwise. It's not very common that you go to your hand-eye coordination, spatial reasoning class in elementary school. So you're developing this skill at a better rate than some of your peers.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add, and this research is not in here, but I was reading about there were these surgeons, and they ended up having them play a video game half an hour a day. And then they had a control group of people who weren't playing video games. And they actually found that the surgeons who were playing video games were better. So their skills at being a surgeon, those fine motor skills, actually improved in comparison to people who didn't. And these are people who had never gamed in their life. So these are just real benefits that you can get from gaming.
Yeah. They're also using some gaming in military to try to train people, and not like I played a lot of Call of Duty, so I'm good at shooting guns, and there's not really a lot of truth to that. Sorry, but they're actually using video games in the military to try to train people on decision making, again, spatial reasoning. If you have to go around this corner and do something, how are you going to do it? How quickly can you make that decision?
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. I actually worked at the VA for a short period of time, and I remember that many of the veterans who were coming back, who were dealing with some of the stress of just reacclimating to civilian society, they actually really liked playing games like Call of Duty and things like that, and it helped them feel a little bit less stressed out. It helped them have like this release of like, oh, this actually feels familiar. Of course, it's not the same, but many men actually thought that it was helpful for them. So what are some positive in-game interactions? I mean, if you're in a guild and you have a really close-knit group of friends, that can be a great support system, right? You can have people who have you back, like your back. You have people who maybe can protect you when the other negative things online are happening. I know that for a while, I was in a group myself. I was the only woman. And I remember that when I started playing with them, things changed dramatically on the Xbox Live. Because I did have a group of people who would defend me, who when people were trying to vote me out because I'm a woman, which happened a lot, they would always unvote. And they'd be like, you know what, you guys are jerks, we're leaving. And it was great to have that group of guys who'd be like, yeah, we're going to support you and we're going to be here for you. One of the things that I really enjoyed that I didn't know you mentioned was how you can use this in real life. You want to talk about the resume?
Yeah. So there's an article that was written kind of recently about the COO of Symantec, like Norton Antivirus kind of stuff. And in getting that position, part of his resume was his World of Warcraft resume. I see some people like, what? And where that came from was, you're asking me to be in a leadership position. Here's an example of my leadership. And was actually able to pull on that as a reference for organization, for leadership, for online interactions. And actually in this person's previous position where they decided this was a good thing to do was with Starbucks. Mm-hmm. You know that Starbucks app that you probably have on your phone where you get the little stars every time you buy something and it's like a little reward? That's where that came from. So this can actually be something that might help you down the road. I'm not saying, go put your MMO of choice on your resume necessarily, but think about how it might be helpful. It might be a thing that could actually benefit you depending on how you spend it.
Yeah, and I would say that even for us, I mean, it's been helpful in my career for sure. Just the fact that I know about this kind of like, well, niche group in psychology that a lot of psychologists don't actually. And so when people come in and they're talking about gaming or anything to do with online interaction, they normally consult with me. And the reason why is because many people are not trained in that. I'm sure you've had similar experiences.
Yeah. Or I'll have that moment where somebody will say, yeah, I was playing LOL last night, and then just kind of that moment where they're looking to see if you respond, and you're like, yeah, I know about League. And they're like, oh, okay, all right, you know.
Yeah.
All right.
So this is one of the studies that I had really enjoyed, but basically that people who play pro-social games, this is actually including shooters if you're on a team, were more likely to help people in person or in their day-to-day interactions. And I thought that was really interesting that when they compared gamers to non-gamers, they were able to not only help more often, but if I remember right from the study, they formed a team easier, everyone kind of had a position, and they were able to get the job done. So that just shows how some of these skills can translate over.
I think sometimes a good real life example too could be if you play some of those games where you might make a decision and then they show how other people made decisions. I'm thinking like Infamous or Catherine, you know, where they might say to you like, here was your decision, here's what other people did. The majority of people tend to pick the good decision, at least kind of the pro-social decision,
Yeah.
like the first time through. And so there is even, you can see those examples around.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know, I just thought that was fun. Because it's true, there's really not a whole lot that's all that bad depending on what happens, but you might hear more about the bad things.
Well, it also depends how you use video games, right? I mean, I think that's what we're trying to say. There's good and negative to everything, and there's a lot of positive things that you can get out of gaming.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mental health, and more specifically in the queer community. One of the things that is important to know is that as queer people, we are a little bit more susceptible to mental health issues. And want to be clear, and this is becoming more clear in the psychology field, it has nothing to do with being queer itself that you may have a problem. It's because of society and society's reactions and the things that you might be up against because of that make us in the community more susceptible to mental health. It has nothing to do with your identity itself. So hopefully that is something that I'm just preaching to the choir at this point, but if not, if that's new information, please hopefully hear that.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that come up a lot is multiple levels of oppression. I mean, there's this thing called intersectionality, which basically means that your different minority statuses start increasing your level of stress. So if you just think like, well, I'm trans, I'm also a person of color, I identify as female, like you just start adding all of those together, and it makes it even more difficult because that means that you're getting a lot of different types of oppression from society. And so things like that can increase your likelihood to develop some sort of depression or anxiety, but it's because of the interactions you're having with others. It's not because there's anything in you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Come along that line, I've read a couple of things about having come out and like to the straight society, like you're gay, so you're different there, but then you come out as a geek,
Mm-hmm.
the gay society, and you're ostracized there. So like there's multiple levels even within different
Right.
societies.
Exactly, and so people can feel those levels of oppression even within a group, and we talk about that a lot. That if you're, like you said, if you're in the queer community and then you say I'm also a gamer, your pool gets a little smaller, and then you may say that you identify as bisexual, so then that oppression kicks in even further. Sadly, even within the community, and same with the trans community, it gets even smaller, and then so you can get down and down into these levels of oppression.
Yeah, and for me, like that's one of the reasons why I thought this convention was so great, honestly, because I know that as a queer woman myself, I I didn't really have that space, right? There's very few places I felt comfortable. And so when this first came around, I was like, wow, there actually is a community. I mean, you can look around, you can see how many people are here. So obviously there is a community, we just have to talk to each other and find each other, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I want to talk about a little bit was just some of the bullying that happens online. And I mean, there is this idea that it might be happening more because people are anonymous and maybe they feel more comfortable in saying things. And so unfortunately, well, we talked about this a little bit already, but when you're having interactions online, you might start getting bullied and having some negative interactions. That's why it's important to check yourself, basically. Now, if you're in that situation, maybe leave the game or maybe find a group of people who are really positive, but to make sure that you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah. The other point on here about coming out, it's important to mention